Introduction: the stories that shape us, uncovering the hidden truth of indigenous myths and the devastating consequences of their erasure. Imagine a world where your ancestors' stories, the ones that made you who you are today, were taken away from you, erased from history, and replaced with someone else's narrative. A world where your cultural identity was reduced to a mere footnote in the grand tome of human history. This is the reality that indigenous communities around the world have faced for centuries, and it's a story that needs to be told. Myths and stories have been the lifeblood of human cultures since the dawn of time. They are the threads that weave our collective identities together, passing down valuable lessons, cultural values, and spiritual beliefs from one generation to the next. But what happens when these stories are taken away, suppressed, or erased? What are the consequences when the very fabric of a culture is torn apart, leaving behind a trail of cultural genocide and historical amnesia? This is the story of indigenous myths and stories, a narrative that has been hidden in plain sight for far too long. It's a story of resilience, of cultural survival, and of the devastating consequences of cultural erasure. It's a story that needs to be told, and it's a story that needs to be heard. The power of myths and stories. Myths and stories have always played a vital role in human cultures. They are the ways in which we make sense of the world around us, how we explain the mysteries of life and death, and how we pass down our values and beliefs. They are the threads that connect us to our ancestors, to our lands, and to our cultures. In indigenous cultures, myths and stories are not just mere entertainment. They are the very fabric of their existence. Indigenous myths and stories are rich in cultural significance, containing valuable lessons about the natural world, the balance of life, and the importance of community and reciprocity. They are the ways in which indigenous cultures have passed down their knowledge, their history, and their cultural values from one generation to the next. They are the stories of creation, of the gods and goddesses, of the ancestors, and of the land. They are the stories that have shaped the very identity of indigenous communities. The devastating consequences of cultural erasure. But what happens when these stories are taken away, suppressed, or erased? What are the consequences when the very fabric of a culture is torn apart, leaving behind a trail of cultural genocide and historical amnesia? The erasure of indigenous myths and stories has had a profound impact on indigenous communities around the world. The consequences of cultural erasure are far-reaching and devastating. It has led to cultural disconnection, identity loss, and historical amnesia. Indigenous communities have been forced to assimilate into dominant cultures, abandoning their traditional ways of life, their languages, and their cultural practices. The erasure of indigenous myths and stories has also led to the loss of cultural knowledge, traditional practices, and spiritual beliefs. The importance of revitalization and resurgence. But it's not all doom and gloom. There is a resurgence of indigenous cultural revitalization happening around the world. Indigenous communities are fighting back against cultural erasure, reclaiming their cultural heritage and revitalizing their languages, cultural practices, and traditional ways of life. This resurgence is not just important for indigenous communities. It's important for all of us. It's a reminder of the rich cultural diversity that exists in the world, a diversity that is worth preserving and celebrating. It's a reminder of the importance of cultural heritage and the devastating consequences of cultural erasure. The purpose of this audiobook. This audiobook is a journey into the world of indigenous myths and stories, a world that has been hidden in plain sight for far too long. It's a journey that will take you through the history of colonization, the suppression of indigenous cultures, and the devastating consequences of cultural erasure. But it's also a journey of hope and resilience, a journey that will introduce you to the vibrant and diverse world of indigenous cultures, and the people who are fighting to preserve their cultural heritage. Through this audiobook, we hope to raise awareness about the importance of indigenous myths and stories, and the devastating consequences of cultural erasure. We hope to inspire listeners to learn more about indigenous cultures, to support indigenous communities in their efforts to preserve their cultural heritage, and to join the fight against cultural erasure. So, join us on this journey, a journey that will take you to the heart of indigenous cultures and the stories that shape us. It's a journey that will change the way you think about culture, identity, and the importance of preserving our collective human heritage. Chapter 1: The Significance of Myths and Stories in Indigenous Cultures. Myths and stories have always been an integral part of human cultures, serving as a means of passing down cultural values, spiritual beliefs, and historical events from one generation to the next. In indigenous cultures, myths and stories hold a special significance, as they are often deeply rooted in the land, the ancestors, and the community. These stories are not just mere entertainment. They are a way of life, a way of understanding the world, and a way of connecting with the divine. The role of myths and stories in indigenous cultures. In indigenous cultures, myths and stories serve several purposes. They provide a sense of identity and belonging, pass down cultural values and spiritual beliefs, explain the natural world and the mysteries of life and death, teach important lessons about community, reciprocity, and respect for the land and the ancestors, preserve historical events and cultural knowledge, offer a way of understanding the world and the human condition. Indigenous myths and stories are often deeply rooted in the land and the ancestors. They are stories about the creation of the world, the gods and goddesses, the ancestors, and the land. They are stories about the struggles and triumphs of the people, and the lessons they learned along the way. These stories are not just mere entertainment. They are a way of life, a way of understanding the world, and a way of connecting with the divine. Examples of indigenous myths and stories. There are countless examples of indigenous myths and stories from around the world. Here are a few. The Dreamtime stories of the Aboriginal people of Australia, which explain the creation of the world and the laws that govern it. The stories of the trickster spirit, Coyote, from Native American cultures, which teach important lessons about community, reciprocity, and respect for the land and the ancestors. The stories of the Maori people of New Zealand, which tell of the creation of the world, the gods and goddesses, and the ancestors. The stories of the Inuit people of the Arctic, which explain the natural world and the mysteries of life and death. The importance of oral tradition. In indigenous cultures, myths and stories are often passed down through oral tradition, from one generation to the next. This oral tradition is a vital part of indigenous cultural heritage, as it allows for the stories to be shared and retold in a way that is both personal and communal. Oral tradition also allows for the stories to be adapted and changed over time, as new generations add their own perspectives and experiences to the stories. This ensures that the stories remain relevant and meaningful to the community, and that they continue to serve as a source of guidance and wisdom. The impact of colonization on indigenous myths and stories. The arrival of European colonizers had a profound impact on indigenous myths and stories. Many indigenous cultures were forced to abandon their traditional ways of life, their languages, and their cultural practices. Their stories were suppressed, erased, or replaced with European stories and myths. This cultural suppression had a devastating impact on indigenous communities, leading to cultural disconnection, identity loss, and historical amnesia. Many indigenous people were forced to assimilate into European cultures, abandoning their traditional ways of life and their cultural heritage. Conclusion. Indigenous myths and stories are a vital part of indigenous cultural heritage, serving as a means of passing down cultural values, spiritual beliefs, and historical events from one generation to the next. They are a way of life, a way of understanding the world, and a way of connecting with the divine. The significance of indigenous myths and stories cannot be overstated. They are a source of guidance, wisdom, and cultural knowledge, and they continue to play an important role in indigenous cultures around the world. In the next chapter, we will explore the history of colonization and its impact on indigenous myths and stories. We will examine the ways in which European colonizers suppressed and erased indigenous cultures, and the devastating consequences of this cultural genocide. Chapter 2: The History of Colonization and the Suppression of Indigenous Myths and Stories. The arrival of European colonizers in the 15th century marked the beginning of a new era for indigenous cultures around the world. It was an era of conquest, suppression, and cultural genocide. Indigenous cultures were forced to adapt to a new reality, one in which their traditional ways of life, their languages, and their cultural practices were seen as inferior and primitive. The conquest of the Americas. The conquest of the Americas was a brutal and devastating process. European colonizers, armed with guns, diseases, and a sense of superiority, swept across the continent, destroying indigenous cultures and communities in their wake. The Spanish conquistador Hernán Cortés, for example, destroyed the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan, killing thousands of people and enslaving many more. The English colonizer John Smith, meanwhile, established the Jamestown settlement in Virginia, displacing the local Powhatan people and sparking a long and bloody conflict. The suppression of indigenous cultures. The suppression of indigenous cultures was a deliberate and systematic process. European colonizers saw indigenous cultures as inferior and primitive, and they sought to erase them from existence. They did this by forcing indigenous people to convert to Christianity, suppressing indigenous languages and cultural practices, destroying indigenous cultural artifacts and texts, enslaving indigenous people and forcing them to work in mines and on plantations, killing indigenous people who resisted colonization. The suppression of indigenous cultures was not just a physical process. It was also a cultural and spiritual one. European colonizers sought to erase indigenous cultures from existence, replacing them with their own cultures and beliefs. They did this by introducing European languages, such as Spanish, English, and French, imposing European cultural practices, such as Christianity and European customs, destroying indigenous cultural artifacts and texts, such as the Aztec codices and the Mayan books, erasing indigenous histories and cultural knowledge. The impact of colonization on indigenous myths and stories. The impact of colonization on indigenous myths and stories was devastating. Many indigenous cultures were forced to abandon their traditional ways of life, their languages, and their cultural practices. Their stories were suppressed, erased, or replaced with European stories and myths. The suppression of indigenous myths and stories had a profound impact on indigenous communities. It led to cultural disconnection. Indigenous people were forced to abandon their traditional ways of life and their cultural practices, leading to a disconnection from their cultural heritage. Identity loss. Indigenous people were forced to adopt European cultures and beliefs, leading to a loss of identity and cultural knowledge. Historical amnesia. The suppression of indigenous histories and cultural knowledge led to a loss of cultural memory and a disconnection from the past. The legacy of colonization. The legacy of colonization can still be seen today. Many indigenous cultures continue to struggle with the consequences of colonization, including cultural disconnection, identity loss, and historical amnesia. The suppression of indigenous myths and stories has also had a profound impact on indigenous communities, leading to a loss of cultural knowledge and a disconnection from the past. Conclusion. The history of colonization and the suppression of indigenous myths and stories is a painful and complex one. It is a history of conquest, suppression, and cultural genocide. But it is also a history of resistance, resilience, and cultural survival. Despite the devastating impact of colonization, indigenous cultures continue to thrive and survive, and their myths and stories continue to play an important role in their lives. In the next chapter, we will explore the ways in which indigenous cultures have resisted colonization and suppressed their cultural heritage. We will examine the ways in which indigenous people have fought back against cultural suppression, and the ways in which they have preserved their cultural knowledge and traditions. Chapter 3: The Erasure of Indigenous Myths and Stories. The erasure of indigenous myths and stories is a deliberate and systematic process that has been ongoing for centuries. It is a process that has been perpetuated by colonialism, imperialism, and other forms of oppression. The erasure of indigenous myths and stories has been done through various means, including suppression of indigenous languages and cultural practices, destruction of indigenous cultural artifacts and texts, replacement of indigenous myths and stories with European ones, erasure of indigenous histories and cultural knowledge, stereotyping and marginalization of indigenous cultures, The suppression of indigenous languages and cultural practices. The suppression of indigenous languages and cultural practices has been a deliberate and systematic process. European colonizers saw indigenous languages and cultural practices as inferior and primitive, and they sought to erase them from existence. They did this by forcing indigenous people to speak European languages, suppressing indigenous cultural practices and traditions, destroying indigenous cultural artifacts and texts, imposing European cultural practices and traditions. The suppression of indigenous languages and cultural practices has had a profound impact on indigenous communities. It has led to language loss. Many indigenous languages have been lost forever, and many more are at risk of disappearing. Cultural disconnection. Indigenous people have been disconnected from their cultural heritage and traditions. Identity loss. Indigenous people have lost their sense of identity and cultural knowledge. The destruction of indigenous cultural artifacts and texts. The destruction of indigenous cultural artifacts and texts has been a deliberate and systematic process. European colonizers saw indigenous cultural artifacts and texts as inferior and primitive, and they sought to erase them from existence. They did this by destroying indigenous cultural artifacts and texts, burning indigenous books and manuscripts, suppressing indigenous cultural knowledge and traditions. The destruction of indigenous cultural artifacts and texts has had a profound impact on indigenous communities. It has led to cultural loss. Many indigenous cultural artifacts and texts have been lost forever. Historical amnesia. Indigenous people have been disconnected from their cultural heritage and traditions. Identity loss. Indigenous people have lost their sense of identity and cultural knowledge. The replacement of indigenous myths and stories. The replacement of indigenous myths and stories with European ones has been a deliberate and systematic process. European colonizers saw indigenous myths and stories as inferior and primitive, and they sought to replace them with their own myths and stories. They did this by imposing European myths and stories on indigenous people, suppressing indigenous myths and stories, erasing indigenous cultural knowledge and traditions. The replacement of indigenous myths and stories has had a profound impact on indigenous communities. It has led to cultural disconnection. Indigenous people have been disconnected from their cultural heritage and traditions. Identity loss. Indigenous people have lost their sense of identity and cultural knowledge. Historical amnesia. Indigenous people have been disconnected from their cultural heritage and traditions. The erasure of indigenous histories and cultural knowledge. The erasure of indigenous histories and cultural knowledge has been a deliberate and systematic process. European colonizers saw indigenous histories and cultural knowledge as inferior and primitive, and they sought to erase them from existence. They did this by suppressing indigenous histories and cultural knowledge, erasing indigenous cultural artifacts and texts, imposing European histories and cultural knowledge. The erasure of indigenous histories and cultural knowledge has had a profound impact on indigenous communities. It has led to historical amnesia. Indigenous people have been disconnected from their cultural heritage and traditions. Identity loss. Indigenous people have lost their sense of identity and cultural knowledge. Cultural disconnection. Indigenous people have been disconnected from their cultural heritage and traditions. Conclusion. The erasure of indigenous myths and stories is a deliberate and systematic process that has been ongoing for centuries. It is a process that has been perpetuated by colonialism, imperialism, and other forms of oppression. The erasure of indigenous myths and stories has had a profound impact on indigenous communities, leading to cultural disconnection, identity loss, and historical amnesia. It is important that we acknowledge and address this erasure and work towards preserving and revitalizing indigenous myths and stories. Chapter 4. The impact of cultural genocide on indigenous communities. Cultural genocide, the deliberate destruction of a group's culture, has had a profound impact on indigenous communities around the world. The effects of cultural genocide are far-reaching and devastating, affecting not only the individual but also the community as a whole. Loss of identity. One of the most significant effects of cultural genocide is the loss of identity. When a group's culture is destroyed, they are left without a sense of self and belonging. This can lead to feelings of disconnection and disorientation, as individuals struggle to understand who they are and where they come from. Disconnection from ancestors. Cultural genocide also leads to a disconnection from ancestors and the land. Indigenous cultures are deeply rooted in their connection to the land and their ancestors. When this connection is broken, individuals are left feeling lost and disconnected from their heritage. Loss of traditional practices. The loss of traditional practices is another significant effect of cultural genocide. Indigenous cultures have developed unique practices and traditions over centuries, and these practices are often tied to their connection to the land and their ancestors. When these practices are lost, the community is left without a sense of continuity and tradition. Erosion of language. Language is a vital part of any culture, and the erosion of language is a significant effect of cultural genocide. When a language is lost, the community is left without a means of communicating their thoughts, feelings, and ideas. Disconnection from community. Cultural genocide also leads to a disconnection from community. Indigenous cultures are often deeply communal, with a strong sense of shared identity and belonging. When this sense of community is lost, individuals are left feeling isolated and disconnected from their peers. Intergenerational trauma. Cultural genocide can also lead to intergenerational trauma, as the effects of cultural destruction are passed down from one generation to the next. This trauma can manifest in a range of ways, including anxiety, depression, and substance abuse. Loss of cultural knowledge. The loss of cultural knowledge is another significant effect of cultural genocide. Indigenous cultures have developed unique knowledge systems over centuries, and these systems are often tied to their connection to the land and their ancestors. When this knowledge is lost, the community is left without a sense of continuity and tradition. Conclusion. Cultural genocide has had a profound impact on indigenous communities around the world. The effects of cultural genocide are far-reaching and devastating, affecting not only the individual but also the community as a whole. It is important that we acknowledge and address the effects of cultural genocide and work towards preserving and revitalizing indigenous cultures. Recommendations. Support indigenous-led initiatives to preserve and revitalize indigenous cultures. Educate yourself about the history and effects of cultural genocide. Advocate for policies and practices that support indigenous cultural preservation and revitalization. Support indigenous artists and cultural practitioners. Learn about and respect indigenous cultural protocols and traditions. By taking these steps, we can work towards a future where indigenous cultures are valued and respected, and where the effects of cultural genocide are addressed and healed. Chapter 5: The Resurgence of Indigenous Cultures. Despite the devastating effects of cultural genocide, indigenous cultures are experiencing a resurgence. This resurgence is a testament to the resilience and determination of indigenous peoples, who are fighting to preserve and revitalize their cultures. Indigenous cultural revitalization. Indigenous cultural revitalization is a process that involves the restoration and revitalization of indigenous cultures, languages, and traditions. This process is led by indigenous peoples themselves, who are working to reclaim and reassert their cultural identities. Language revitalization. Language is a critical component of indigenous cultural revitalization. Many indigenous languages are at risk of disappearing, and language revitalization efforts are underway to preserve and revitalize these languages. Cultural education. Cultural education is another important aspect of indigenous cultural revitalization. Indigenous peoples are working to develop culturally based education programs that teach indigenous languages, histories, and cultural practices. Traditional practices. Indigenous peoples are also working to revitalize traditional practices such as hunting, gathering, and fishing. These practices are not only important for subsistence but also for cultural and spiritual purposes. Art and cultural expression. Indigenous art and cultural expression are also experiencing a resurgence. Indigenous artists are using traditional and contemporary forms of art to express their cultural identities and experiences. Community-based initiatives. Community-based initiatives are a key component of Indigenous cultural revitalization. Indigenous communities are coming together to develop and implement cultural revitalization programs that are tailored to their specific needs and contexts. Government support. Government support is also crucial for Indigenous cultural revitalization. Governments are beginning to recognize the importance of Indigenous cultural preservation and are providing funding and resources to support Indigenous cultural revitalization efforts. Challenges and opportunities. Despite the progress that has been made, there are still many challenges and opportunities facing Indigenous cultural revitalization. Some of the challenges include lack of funding and resources, limited access to cultural knowledge and practices, cultural appropriation and exploitation, government policies and laws that suppress Indigenous cultures. However, there are also many opportunities for Indigenous cultural revitalization, including increased recognition and support from governments and institutions, growing interest in Indigenous cultures and languages, development of new technologies and methods for cultural preservation and revitalization, increased empowerment and self-determination of Indigenous peoples. Conclusion: the resurgence of Indigenous cultures is a testament to the resilience and determination of Indigenous peoples. Despite the devastating effects of cultural genocide, Indigenous cultures are experiencing a revitalization, and this resurgence is led by Indigenous peoples themselves. However, there are still many challenges and opportunities facing Indigenous cultural revitalization, and it is important that we continue to support and empower Indigenous peoples in their efforts to preserve and revitalize their cultures. Recommendations: support Indigenous-led cultural revitalization initiatives. Advocate for government policies and laws that support Indigenous cultural preservation and revitalization. Educate yourself about Indigenous cultures and histories. Support Indigenous artists and cultural practitioners. Learn about and respect Indigenous cultural protocols and traditions. By taking these steps, we can support the resurgence of Indigenous cultures and help to ensure the preservation and revitalization of Indigenous cultures for future generations.